Now you can absolutely write this client-side data fetching code on your own as we did it here. There's nothing wrong with that. And you might have good reasons to do that because this, of course, gives you full control over the entire component state and how exactly data is being fetched. But this is also such a common pattern that you could consider creating your own custom hook to outsource this logic into it, or to use a third-party hook created by someone else. And you can look into the SWR hook. If you Google for useSWR, you will find swr.versal.app. This is a React hook developed by the NextJS team, but you can use it in non-NextJS projects as well. In the end, this is a hook which under the hood still will send a HTTP request, by default using the fetch API, which we also used, but it gives you a couple of nice built-in features like caching and automatic revalidation, retries on error, and you don't have to write all that code on your own. Instead, you can use this hook in a much simpler way. The strange name, SWR, by the way, stands for stale while revalidate, which is the name of this hook because this hook has a built-in features for caching data and revalidating data to give you the most up-to-date data without you noticing in a positive way, and so on. Now you can dive into the docs of this hook to learn all about it, because you can definitely also create a short course about this hook here, but getting started with it, thankfully, is super simple. In our project, we just need to quit the dev server and install it as a package. With npm install SWR, we install this SWR hook package into our project. Now in last sales, if we want to use it, we can import it. We can import useSWR from SWR, just like this. This imports the hook. It's the same example you see here. And now you can use this hook in your component, so not inside of useEffect, but directly in your component. All React hooks must be used directly in a component, not in some nested function. And we use it by simply executing it. Now this hook wants at least one argument, which is an identifier for the request it should send, typically the URL of that request. And it's also called an identifier because this hook will bundle multiple requests to the same URL, which are sent in a certain time frame, into one request to avoid sending dozens of small requests. Not an issue we'll have here, but nice to have in general. So we can grab our URL here as an identifier because it will then conveniently use this identifier as a URL as well. And in the simplest form, this is all we have to do. You can add a second argument, which is a fetcher function, which is a function that describes how the request should be sent. But the default is that it will use the fetch API, so if we want to stick to that default, which I do here, we don't need to change anything. Instead, we just call useSWR like this, and a request to this URL will be sent when this component is loaded. So now we can work with the data which is returned by that hook. And that will be an object, which we can destructure therefore, which contains the data that was fetched eventually and potential error information. So I'll use the exact same object destructuring here and pull out the data which we eventually get and the error which we might get. Down here in our custom code we have no error handling, but now we can easily implement it by just using this extra piece of data which we get by the useSWR hook. So now with that we can comment out our custom hook. We could also delete it, but I want to keep it around for reference. We can also comment out our custom states though. And now we can work with data and error. If we don't have data yet, then we know that we're loading. So here I'll check if not data. If we don't have data yet, then I return loading. If we have an error on the other hand, I want to show an error message here like failed to load. And we should move that in front of the if data check, because an error is more important than the loading state. If we have an error, I want to show it. Now, if we don't have an error and we do have data, so if we make it past these two if checks, then we can output the data. Now, the problem we'll then face, however, is that, as I mentioned, the data we get back from Firebase is not in the right format. We need to transform it. Now, to work around that issue, we got two main approaches. We could define our own fetcher function. You can learn about that here in the SWR docs to basically fine-tune how exactly data will be fetched and returned. Or we again use useEffect, but now not for sending the request, but for simply transforming the data. So then here, our dependency would be the data which we get, because I want to rerun this whenever we got new data. And in useEffect, I want to check if we do have data, because if we don't have data, there's nothing we need to do. But if I do have data, then I want to go through these transformation steps here. So I'll copy this code from down there, comment this in, and then bring back my sales state here so that I can set this state after we transformed the data here in useEffect. So here, inside of this if check still, inside of useEffect, I'll then set my sales to the transformed sales, which are now based on the data key we're getting from useSWR. So now we have our own transformation logic here, which will be kicked off as soon as data was fetched. And that means that now again down there, we can check that even if we have data, it might not have been transformed yet. So if we don't have sales yet, which is our transformed data, I still return a paragraph where I also say loading, for example. And of course, therefore, we can merge this and say if we don't have data or we don't have sales, I want to return loading. But if we do have both, then we can safely again output our sales. And that's how we can now use SWR and still apply our own transformation logic. With all of that, if we now save this and restart the development server, we should again have a working page. If we go back to last sales and reload, we see loading, and eventually we see the data. And still, if I view the page source, we don't see the data there, but instead we now see loading. We see loading here because that is the starting state, the first initial version of this component which is being rendered. Because initially error is undefined, so we don't return this, and data and sales are undefined, so we do return this. And therefore that's what we see as part of the pre-rendered page. And again, data fetching only happens on the client side. Now using this hook, this useSWR hook, is not mandatory. As you saw, you can write your own logic, you don't need to use it. It just can be convenient to use this hook because you save a little bit of code, especially if you also would add error handling down there. And this hook also has a bunch of other nice features which we're not using here, but which can also be very handy, like automatically refetching data when you lose and regain focus and other things like this. So that's something you can also look into, but for the moment, that's all I wanted to show here, because now we also know how we can implement client-side data fetching.